In the beginning, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat.
No, Odysseus, let him rack his brains with you and the other captives.
I
How to fight.
guilty.
Impossible. Trust me.
No one to weep for me, my friends. No wedding song.
Amo verumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris Italiam
Dante ha fatto il pieno e per gli altri è rimasto ben poco, which means that Dante filled up.
I was the more deceived.
Confess that you were very bad to hurt my feelings.
Cried Candide, I'm through.
Enough. Who are you then?
Part of that force which would do evil evermore, and yet
She was eating a maraschino ice at that precise moment.
There is no
When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous dung beetle.
Hi, and here we are for our last session, number 24. I'm laughing for some reason. It must be the Kafka that we did in the first hour. Relief, yes. This has been a long, strange journey, hasn't it?
Too short.
Too short, yeah, great. I agree with you. I'll miss it terribly. We've taken a really long journey through a lot of centuries. Looking at some big literature which deals with some big ideas. There are a number of questions I want to ask you, but I guess the one I want to start with the most is, which was the favorite work this term? Easy question, right? Which one spoke to you the most? Which one did you find yourself most engaged by? Yeah.
I would say Madame Bovary.
Really?
Myself, yeah.
Yes.
Just the entanglements and the traps and the physicality, the sensualness of it all. Credit cards, I mean, that's all I can think about.
Yes,
and
yeah.
also, my favorite line, as I was thinking about this the other day, my favorite line of the entire semester, when she goes to see Guillermin, one of the last-ditch efforts, there are many, to rustle up some moolah, and she walks into his dining room, and here she is enmeshed in these huge bills and debts, and she's just about to commit suicide. She sees all these things in the beautiful dining room, and she says, I need a dining room like this.
Yes, yeah. Poor Emma, trying to transcend it. You know, that raises a couple of questions that I'll want to ask you now to provoke a little discussion. What are Emma's ways of transcending the reality of her life? What are the avenues available to her?
They're mostly material, aren't they?
They are, aren't they? Yeah. She does not have within her the ability to be an artist. I mean, think of the means usually available to us to transcend the vagaries of daily life. You know, she doesn't have art as an escape, to be sure. She is not self-reflective enough, obviously, to find her place within things. So she seems to buy the values of the society of which she is a part, or to which she aspires, perhaps is a better way of putting that, and then she apes those mores in a wonderfully inauthentic way. That's part of the that's part of the tragedy, isn't it, of Emma? You know, is that she really does lead a life kind of divorced from her inner self, yet on the other hand, sound like an intellectual, or worse, an economist, you know, on the one hand, but on the other hand, she is the only one in that milieu with some spark of life, you know, some spark of poetry, some spark of life can be better, can be more exciting. And it's a curious, Flaubert captures, I think, extremely well that curious grasshopper, you know, that Goethe used as a metaphor, that we are so earthbound, and yet our moments of flight are really quite flavorful.
I thought it interesting that Flaubert wrote this not only painstakingly because his thought of it being almost poetic, the using of phrases, but that he wrote about people he really disliked.
Oh, yes, he did.
He did not like the middle classes, and I think that he chose this as almost a penance, but you know, because he really was writing about people that while he knew them, he didn't want to be a part of that group.
Yes. That's
but
a good
his
point
choice of language was so great.
It's a gorgeous novel, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a beautifully written novel. Yeah, I thought we had a good class when we talked about Crime and Punishment as a novel compared to Flaubert, and that Mr. Wozoliak from University of Chicago captured beautifully the difference between the two. Yeah, I want to hear other votes for works, just for the heck of it, because this
Crime and Punishment.
is it? Yeah. Now why?
I relate to that because the underlying love as redemption to me speaks to me.
Yeah.
And maybe because that Dostoevsky is part of my heritage too. I relate so much to peasants and the struggles, and I like his probing the psyche.
Yeah, he surely does that. I mean, it is one of the most penetrating of novels that you'll probably ever read. Yeah, and when you say you like the notion of love as redemption, what does that mean?
Well, I believe in love as redemption.
Yeah.
And
a lot of works this term did.
Yeah, and of course with Metamorphosis, I think if he had love in his life, that might have changed the color of the whole story.
Yeah, if he had a self to give to others. Yeah.
You'd love yourself before you love others.
Yeah, but he doesn't have that, does he? No, he's truly an insect. He has no self to give. Yeah. Barbara.
Well, I'm going to pick two. I like Candide. I always have, and I like the ironic humor in Candide and the offhandedness of it, and the idea of society impinging on our lives to such an extent. And then on the other hand, I liked Paradise Lost.
All right, so you're going to get an A in this course.
But the spirituality and the depth of it, and the universality of it.
Yeah. Okay.
Both.
Yeah, good. Let me hear others. Peter?
I like the Aeneid. I was very moved by the story of the fall of Troy.
Yeah.
But then rising from the ashes of Troy, he goes on to, with a great deal of self-sacrifice and a great deal of vision, he goes on to build a new civilization. It was a very optimistic story. And I guess that's why I liked it.
Yeah, good for you. That's it's a very mature epic. I mean, to my mind, Aeneid compared to Iliad is the difference between a mature adult and a 13-year-old. Not to belittle Homer, but it just doesn't have the depth, I think, of Aeneid. Interesting point. Boy, we're going back in time for our faves here. Yeah, Virginia?
That was what I was going to say. Thank you, Peter. But I found myself, it must be a matter of people's personalities, the direction they go, because I found myself very comfortable with the Aeneid and this idea that driven by responsibility, you proceed onward in spite of, but not the pessimism of the Russians, where what they did seemed to be a terrible burden. They had optimism. They had a goal in the Aeneid, which I really cared for very much.
Yeah, despite what he was carrying on his back, his gaze, which is all of the past, his gaze was always forward, wasn't it? Yeah.
And the regrets over the loss of friends and stalwart companions, but the justification that for life to proceed for others, he must.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. You're pointing out part of the point I mean between the difference between an adult and the more self-centered Achilles. Although Homer does strike to the tragedy of Achilles' fate in a just extraordinary way. I mean, that scene with Priam in Book 24 is just breathtaking in its maturity and in its depth and in its sense of feeling, as is the death of Hector. Just an extraordinary scene.
But it's almost a motto. The gods have made me do it. This in spite of that. I mean, their belief is so strong.
Yeah.
That they have no other choice.
Yeah. Let me hear from others, if I may. I'm not asking for great depth of response, but it is curious to see that we're all over the place, aren't we, in our responses? Yeah.
I had narrowed it down to three: Tartuffe, Candide, and Madame Bovary.
Oh, wow, okay.
And I decided
something about that French sensibility.
I narrowed it down for no really heavy or high, lofty thoughts about it. I decided on Tartuffe because I like the good laugh in the face of conventionality.
Yeah, it's a riot, isn't it? Yeah, good. It is a very, very funny stage play. Yes. Yeah, good. Yeah. Others?
I like The Death of Ivan Ilyich because it's it's really very contemporary. People are making the same mistakes today. You probably know some of them.
Sure.
And they're so easy to do.
Oh yeah, they sure are. Of course, I don't make those mistakes, but others do. Yeah, Chad.
Yeah, I agree. I liked The Death of Ivan Ilyich a lot because I could relate so well to that character. But on top of that, another work that I really enjoyed was Antigone.
Yeah.
I really admire that character a lot, and I think that was, out of all the characters that I can think of so far, when I just thought, okay, which character do I really like, Antigone's name popped up right away. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that she was just a very strong woman. And that's something that I really, really admired. And I thought, wow, that was something that just stood out. I mean, not to belittle anybody that came before, like Hector or any of those other heroes, but just Antigone in her own way just had this strength that I was just so impressed by.
See, now you're a contemporary man. Strong women have not always been every man's cup of tea.
The bizarre thing is, I've always felt that way. That was one thing I could never really understand. I never could understand this inequality of the sexes because, I don't know, maybe I'm just raised in a different way, but I never could, I still don't understand why that equality is. I know that there is an inequality, thank you. But I read back, I look back at all these works and then I just see the character of Antigone and I think, wow, here's a character that defied the will of the state, defied everybody, and an appeal because of that unconditional love she had for her brother. I thought, wow, that's pretty deep. You know, that's quite a commitment.
Yeah, she's obviously an admirable character for that reason, and it is a strikingly contemporary play. I remember when, for our video insert, we had talked to Justice Simon about this play, and it's, I mean, look, we're taping this. I'm not supposed to leave clues, I think, about when we are taping things, but we are taping things when Nelson Mandela is about to become president of a new South Africa. Who would have believed that 10 years ago? Who would have believed the power of civil disobedience in a state where we thought we'd never see something like that? It's absolutely remarkable.
Dostoevskian character, all that suffering in prison, his self-enlightenment, and look where he is. He's on top of the mound now.
Well,
yeah, Rosemary?
Naturally, I picked Job. No one, I was waiting for someone to be a partner in this, but I admire all these characters that every once in a while you have these marvelous striking figures like Antigone and Iliad and Madame Bovary that just sort of striving, and man's intellect comes to the surface and you see how beautiful man can rise to it. But then we always wonder, why did this happen? And I can't understand this and that. And and same with Job, you wonder, here was a righteous man. Why did he have to go through all this? And because man has a finite mind, he can just go so far. But we won't give all the glory to who it should belong to, the big man up there, because his mind is infinite, and he could surface, he could encompass all this, he could give an answer to it. And like he said to Job, were you there when I made the Leviathan? Were you there when I measured the waters? Were you there? I mean, how dare man think that he could just reach the skies? I mean, he could try, and I'm sure that God wants him to, but...
Obviously, Job raises one of those enduring human questions, and we have seen it repeat itself right through the course, haven't we? This notion of innocent suffering, and what will the suffering issue in? And so many of the things we've read this term, for there to be a new self, for there to be a new, and by that I mean a new definition of where you are in relation to life in the, with a capital L, suffering is attendant upon it. Have you noticed that? That Greek notion that wisdom alone, as the choral odes would say, wisdom alone comes through suffering. And we see so much of that during the course of the term. Now, all the answers are not the same, to be sure. That is one answer among many that people have forwarded to explain innocent suffering.
Really searches when he's suffering. When he's happy, he doesn't do any too much inner
We didn't see a lot of happy. Yeah.
Madame Bovary will live on as my favorite on the course.
Yeah.
But the one that I look back on that I think I'll remember is the Book of Job, because on rereading it, I saw that Job didn't suffer as patiently as you get the opinion that he did. He railed against God. And I think I had the impression of a patient, all-suffering Job willingly. And it was a new aspect that I hadn't come across before.
Yes, good point. I mean, a lot of students say that they come into Job hearing about the patience of Job, and then by chapter 4 they're going, huh? What is this? I mean, this guy's almost heretical, you know, where is this patience? Let me go to Charlie, I haven't heard from him.
I find it interesting that the majority of the women who have spoken have chosen Madame Bovary. I wonder if we have any amateur or professional psychiatrists in the group to explain that. That's just by the by.
Yeah. Are we going to let him get away with that?
Raise your hand. I have the floor. My choice was, and I'm surprised it hasn't even been mentioned, the bright star in the Western literature, Hamlet, for its the eloquence of the language and the fact that its psychological insights predated a profession that wasn't even founded for 250 years. The credit goes to Shakespeare. Of course, I wonder if this is in the nature of, could be in the nature of, say, of an Orpheus descending, that Phil Shakespeare now is losing some of his audience, and the Madame Bovarys and the others have come to the fore. But Hamlet forever, I say.
Yeah, it's endlessly fascinating, to be sure. Yes.
Well, I am going to differ with that, because after rereading it again this time, I think of him as a crybaby schoolboy who committed a crime for his own sake rather than for his father's. And, and I wanted to bring up the fact about strong women. We did not see a lot of strong women in this. Antigone certainly is one, and maybe Dido. But all the other women seem to be ruled by their passions or ruled by society or the men in their lives.
Except I would say Eve. I mean, she was strong. I mean, to defy God. I mean, that took a lot.
Yes, Eve was both, actually, wasn't she? She's the tradition. Milton was, of course, cornered there because he could not ignore the tradition which he inherited, which was a very negative view of Eve as moved by her passions. You're right in pointing out that so many of the women during the course of the term are like passion incarnate. You know, it's as if they have no brains at all, and that they react only viscerally to things. Milton is trapped by having that tradition of the Eve, but then putting a spin on it that is quite positive, actually, and turning Eve into redemptive love, as you pointed out.
And this idea of suffering, too. This suffering for suffering's sake kind of bothers me, too, because even toward the end, we realize that there should come an end to suffering, and one must think of the individual.
I'm not sure we see a lot of suffering for suffering's sake in the course of the course.
Well, I'm thinking of Sonia.
Yes, but I'm not sure that's for suffering's sake. It's not as an end in itself for Sonia. It's for its redemptive qualities. It's for what it can do, can do for others. She is other-directed rather than so self-directed. Hamlet's close. That's exactly what I was thinking of. If there is a person in what we've read this term who seemed to revel in the suffering a bit, it was Hamlet. But again, the complexity of that character, I can say that, and then I can turn right around and do another one of those on the other hand, and that's one of the things that's enduring about Hamlet. This is fun, isn't it fun to you to hear? We've never talked about this, not even out in the hall between classes, which has been the favorite work. And we haven't missed a whole lot. Goethe's Faust, I hear no votes for. And I'm not surprised. That's a tough one.
Yeah. Because, I mean, I was able to identify with at least one aspect of the story, of all the stories we read.
Yeah.
And by being able to identify with that one aspect, as I was reading that story, that was my favorite story.
Yes, I hear you.
And so to choose one out of all those is really hard to do.
I don't know if it was my most favorite, but it was my most meaningful, was the death of Ivan Ilyich.
That's what I wanted to ask people. Was there anything you read this term that really affected you as a person,
Really thought
that
was
made you
very-
view things differently, or made you stop in your tracks and go, whoa, you know, that, and
When I first started to read it, I was going,
Yeah.
And as I got to going, I couldn't put it down.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, I had to
Yeah.
start it about 3 times. Like those first few pages, I just didn't want to get through. And then it was just fascinating.
And what happens to you? Do you start to do with your own
An
life what Ivan does with
understanding and
his?
just a wonderfulness of the story, and
Yeah.
and I just really could. I just felt for it.
Good. That's our course title, you know, is Living Literature, and we've deliberately picked dinosaurs to read. You know, we really have been engaged in a rather large unnatural act here for several weeks. That is, we're reading things that a lot of people don't read anymore, because they're very old, and you know we've redefined what's central in terms of what one reads, and a lot of this stuff has been tossed by the wayside, and may yet be completely tossed by the wayside. I don't know. I'd be surprised if many of them were completely ignored, but there will be some that will simply drop off the, off the scope. And one of the things I wanted you to get from a course like this was that these things really do have a kind of vitality that sometimes sneaks up on you, that you're not really quite sure going in, classic being Death of Ivan Ilyich, where for most Americans you wade through those first few pages and it's like, oh my goodness, you know, this isn't going to go anywhere, and then suddenly it just sucks you in, and you discover that if I allow myself to get sucked into this, and if I allow myself to start to view the world as Ivan does, I might start to view my life differently. And that's, yeah.
I thought if everyone
sobering.
if everyone could view their life and see, you know, they could learn so much.
Yeah.
From
Yeah,
that
you get almost missionary, don't you, about some of these works where you want to say, if only everybody would read Ivan Ilyich, if only everybody could.
Frankly, there wasn't one work that I read that didn't affect me one way or the other. And I found myself wishing over and over again that there was some way of sharing more of thoughts through a journal or something like that. Because this course has affected me very strongly, good and bad.
Yeah, right.
Positively and
yeah, right. The journal idea I encourage you to do. There's nothing quite like keeping a journal as you read. Some of you are inveterate readers. Virginia, you read probably more than anybody I have ever met. And
but you read on the tollway and I don't.
Yeah.
Only at the lights.
But journal keeping I encourage you to do as you read. But I'll tell you what there's no substitute for, and that's what we're doing right here. There's just, didn't you all have a sense that there was such a difference between you and the text, and then you, the text, and a group? It really is remarkable, isn't it, what happens to that text when the group comes at it. Yeah, there's almost no substitute for it.
Our time is too limited, though, so we don't always get to explore
but your time is always too limited. In a course like this, we really could have done 15 weeks on any one course, on any one work. And indeed, even 15 weeks, you'd be frustrated. Yeah. No doubt this is introductory at best. This was to get you a taste of these things. And one hopes you'll go back to them. Yeah.
I view things in so many different ways. I can be moved by a very descriptive passage. And I feel that some of the Russian writers, Dostoevsky for one, can make me feel right along with him. And then I read another, and like Flaubert, and it's just like a TV. It's built, you see the whole scene. You get a complete feeling about an atmosphere and environment. This is, I think, the language itself, no matter the content, the language of these writers is what makes them the classics.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you're absolutely right to use Flaubert as an example, because he really did invent the art novel. In many ways, Virgil is equally beautiful, but it's hard for you to get that in translation. If you compare Aeneid to Homer, for example, it's quite different. It's much more consciously artistic, much more consciously poetic. It's much more designed for the study than it is for the campfire. It's for a different world, a much more refined world.
Sophocles, when we're talking about the torment of Antigone, you can feel, you don't have to analyze why, but just the way.
Oh, I see, yes. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, a lot of the literature we read this term.
Wonderful vocabulary.
While it admits of a lot of analysis, a lot of the pieces you read and simply react to. Do you know what I'm talking about here? I think Metamorphosis is a good case in point. That story has an extraordinary power that only hours later do you really start to put your finger on. Do you understand what I'm saying? That you read that and you're reading it through and you really don't have those little analyzers on very long, because you do have them on at first for sure, trying to figure out what's going on here. And then you discover pretty quickly it ain't working. And you better just throw yourself into the story and go with the story. A lot of the plays are that way too. Hamlet, the most analyzed play. Thank you. The most analyzed play in the Western culture is first and foremost a kind of visceral theatrical experience. It's only really later that you start to invent your Hamlet on the basis of that experience.
But Milton, because I read Milton to myself and my cat.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't poetry in that sense, but I kept thinking, I can feel from the last couple of lines that I have read, there's an echo that runs through. It is just beautiful.
Yes, and Milton should be read out loud. I mean, to get into his cadences and to get into his sonorous rhythms and things. It is best to read him out loud.
My most frustrating was Dante. I didn't like being stuck in the inferno. I would like to go on to paradise.
But for a believer in redemptive love, at least you knew he was moving in the right direction, right? Yeah. Unlike most of us, he got out of the dark wood. He had a guide.
Nobody mentioned Genesis now. Why is that, I wonder? That's the beginning of all the trouble.
We mentioned Eve.
Because I haven't said anything yet.
I haven't been keeping track. I don't think I've heard from you guys either, so get ready. I'm coming. Yeah.
Thinking of the question, which was the favorite, I found that incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it is.
To pick, you know, which one. But which ones have affected most profoundly was easier to address.
Yeah.
The first part, I feel like every one of these characters lurks somewhere in every one of us.
Yeah.
Really. We all have potential to be any of them. We're all of them.
Yeah.
But with Genesis and Job, I've found myself discussing at different points with people. I liked the relationship, even as it worked out between Adam and Eve. I liked Eve, and I liked Antigone, and I liked Ivan Ilyich.
Yeah.
Just the timelessness of all of them, and the fact that they were more active. They stood more for what they felt. They did more, I think. That's not coming off right with Ivan Ilyich, but the point of him, even like last week, my tetanus shot expired on April 27th, and I cut myself on a tin can, just a small one, like 3 days before that. I had known the shot expired, but what I thought as soon as this little nick occurred, I thought of Ivan Ilyich.
You could have been storming a fort.
And what I thought was, if people they die for some of the stupidest things. We all fear cancer and heart disease, and we wouldn't like to have an automobile accident. But we have these inoculations, and one of the big crises in healthcare right now is people aren't even having their children inoculated. And I could have not done anything, it was just a little nick, but You know, I could have died.
Yeah.
It happens in real life too. And I guess that's the point about all the things we read, is everyone struck me with, this happens in real life too.
Yes, there's a common humanity to the experience.
That's why those stories live forever.
Absolutely.
Well, that's what compels, I think it's what compelled the authors, and there's no other word for this.
Human nature.
What compelled either the authors or the editors that decided to save these things was that there was something about them that had to be put down into a form that was permanent. You understand what I'm saying? Writing was permanent then. And to use Genesis as your example, there was something in that Adam and Eve story that needed to be permanently put down and passed along. There was something in the Iliad that had existed for a long, long time, verbally. There was something important there that needed to be put down, put down in writing. And that's part of that. I think why we keep it is because of that connection that we can make.
I was looking for a tape that I have of Father Michael Germail he was in Beaumont, Texas, the last I knew, and he delivered an address where he used Genesis, and he said that some of the basic psychic human truths are in that book.
Yes.
They're all there. I wanted to find that and listen to it again before today, and I wasn't able to, but I'm going to find it.
Yeah.
And
that's its mythic quality. Yeah.
You know, when we judge people now, they always go back to their childhood, and then we weep with them, and we say, well, he couldn't help it. He had to look at his childhood. Poverty was there, and no teaching, and this and that. But if you go back to Genesis, you don't say, well, look at poor Eve. She was seduced by this serpent, and that fruit looked beautiful, you know. Now, you couldn't help it. I mean, right is right and wrong is wrong. If we came
There you go again, Rosemary. I thought you weren't going to do that again.
That's where we're at. That's where we're at in the 90s. We just can't make a strong statement. You know, we just can't do it.
You know, that was the thing about Genesis, and I rambled around because I couldn't think of what I wanted to say, but what it was it has changed my perspective on that fall.
Yes.
I no longer think of that.
Yes.
Good. As a
fall. Yeah, it's a rise,
isn't
it?
I look at it as the rise of an entirely different species whom God loved still.
That's correct.
The disobedience was offensive to him, and there were dues to pay. But he guaranteed continued communication.
But this species has to struggle, has to survive, has to rise above now, where before they would have been so simple. It would have been.
I don't want to get us back into our Genesis thing because I don't. I'm going to. Susan will say it wasn't so beautiful before. It wasn't so.
We don't. Well, I'm going to say we don't know.
Yeah,
we do not know a thing about it.
Right.
We fantasize everything we don't like about our lives now, and we say paradise had none of that. But we can't even conceptualize what that was. There's just like one more level between the angels working your way on down.
The great chain of being. I'm moving on. How about that for a lead-in? Eric, how about you? You got a favorite work or something that changed?
I couldn't possibly choose. I think the favorite work is the work of bringing them all together and bringing all of us together and putting that together with our lives. And none of these works is really as valuable as it is if it's isolated from all the others.
Yeah, I agree with that, actually. And that's something you guys did extremely well all term, was the ability to pick up the past as we moved through. Do you remember how many times I said to you, very good, you know, you see, you know, how he's using this or how somebody's using that. And the real work of art is what we do here. Yeah, it's what we create here out of the raw material of the works and one another. Yeah. How about favorite?
Again, an incredibly difficult choice.
Yeah, it is. It's a silly question in a way, but it's a fun question to ask.
Having to identify one, probably Hamlet.
Yeah.
Because being the one that I have read more frequently, it's the one that has changed the most.
Yes.
Every time I read Hamlet, he is someone
Something
different. Sometimes he's a prince, sometimes he's a crybaby, sometimes he's a Renaissance man. Living, yes.
Yeah.
And also Shakespeare's language is so beautiful and so changing and so alive.
Yeah.
I think perhaps that one.
Yeah, that's a good, two very good points. I bet you we all agree with what was just said. I mean, Hamlet really, there is no Hamlet. There are just all of these Hamlets.
And all of us.
Yeah, right, exactly, right. I asked this question, we have a little video here that I want to share with you. During our England trip, I couldn't resist asking a Job scholar and a Shakespeare scholar and a Milton scholar and a Dante scholar, how on earth, you could have been an honest person and gone out and been a plumber or something, how is it that you'd spend your whole life studying Dante and your whole life studying Shakespeare, Milton? And let's take a look at what their responses are. I think you'll find it interesting, yeah. What provoked them to dedicate themselves to these works of literature?
I also found early on that knowing Greek and Hebrew was a good way of winning arguments, because if something hung upon the ancient text, then anyone who could say, well, in the Greek it actually says something or other, then you were home and dry. And that's not quite as crass as I make it sound. It was, I suppose, a desire to get it right, and I think I care a lot about getting it right, in as much as you can do that when you don't believe in determinate meanings anymore. But getting it right was a lot to do with it. And when it comes to the Book of Job, I think I was attracted to it because it was so difficult. The Hebrew is very difficult. The meaning of the book as a whole is very hard to get your hands on and be satisfied with. And I think I was testing my strength, actually, to tell you the truth. But I'm intrigued by puzzles and by hard things.
But in Dante there was this obsession to create this text, this book, which could be the equivalent of a world. And given that, you've got a wealth and richness and possibility and a complexity, because it's like trying to say everything about the world today in one single work. The possibilities are endless. You're never bored with Dante. You're never bored at the intellectual level because he's an incredibly intellectually demanding poet. But also you're never bored because it's such good poetry. The way in which he manipulates language is so fascinating.
The mind of Shakespeare is so infinitely capacious that I never cease to be aware not only of the way that he's a great poet, but he's a great thinker. And I find that getting my mind round the big Shakespearean texts is actually a way of getting round the big political, personal, and cultural problems of our time.
When I finished the thesis, there was all this stuff going on in Eastern Europe, all this 1989 business, and there seemed to be a place where politics and history and how an individual can contribute were coming together. Having just finished working on Milton, I decided, this is it, you have to try this out. So I went to Prague and taught there for 2 years. And it gave me a very much more concrete sense of history actually touching the individual. I met people and had occasions where these things actually occur. That was all really from reading Milton, who sent me out there. So these things can change your life.
You cannot praise a fugitive in cloistered virtue.
Right. Sally out into the dust and heat of battle, which is what he says.
Yeah. That's a remarkable response. Actually, 4 really very interesting and different responses. Did you notice that? David Klein's much more earthbound, wanting to get it right. We all understand that. And so he's dedicated himself to being the world's great editor of the Book of Job, to get it right. And then by contrast, Baranski's notion of the hugeness of Dante and how he's never bored by Dante. You can feel his energy, can't you? And you can understand that this guy probably gets bored fairly easily with things, but not with Dante. And then to Mick Hattaway, who was our very gracious host at the University of Sheffield, and his reaction to Shakespeare, the largeness of Shakespeare. And then he struck a very interesting personal note, I thought, when he said that wrapping his brain around Shakespeare's big issues was also wrapping his brain around the political, personal, and social issues of the day. And then the most personal response of all, I thought, was the last from Rachel Faulkner. The Milton woman, that's a funny, you know what I mean, who was enough moved by Milton to really go out into the heat of battle, to really go to ground zero in terms of political and social change, and to go to Prague in 1989 to be at that interface of history and society and ideas. Yeah. That's a very Miltonic idea. That you notice at the end I said to her, I cannot praise a fugitive in cloistered virtue, which is out of Areopagitica, something that he had written. And in fact, it's deep into the idiom of Paradise Lost. They have to get out into the world and forge their destiny.
I would love to do Dante in Italian, because the little inserts there,
yes.
There's such a different connotation.
Of course, of course, yeah.
Would you be willing to let us, we know that your Milton is a favorite with you. Would you share with us your reason for the same question you asked Ben?
It's so much easier to ask the questions, Virginia, than to answer them. But I got to Milton in a strange way. I couldn't read him as an undergraduate. I just thought he was awful. I got him first as a sophomore in the Standard English Lit Survey, the Standard Norton Survey of the day, and just didn't get it. I mean, it just sounded awful to me. And I had about 5 years of Latin already by the time I came to Milton. So it wasn't so much the style that was throwing me. I just thought he was dry as dust. Why would anybody read, Paradise Lost, Adam and Eve? Get out of here. I wanted to listen to rock and roll. So then got him again my senior year in a seminar, and found that unbearable, but somehow made it through. Just unbearable. Couldn't stand it. Is this a surprise? Then went to graduate school and was taught in graduate school a classic and medieval world literature course, which forced me to teach for the first time Iliad, Aeneid, classical texts. And then suddenly, in a graduate course on Milton, suddenly, something you alluded to before, all of the reading now that I could bring to bear on the text made the text vital for the first time. I hated that going down to footnotes. I don't envy first readers of Milton, and going down and seeing Hector, and then getting a footnote saying defender of Troy. I mean, you guys now, if you see that footnote, it's laughable, isn't it? I mean, to reduce Hector to 3 words, defender of Troy, does not quite get it, So it wasn't until graduate school that I was really turned on by him. And then it wasn't until I actually taught him that I started to read deeply into Milton, and was really turned on by his wisdom, it seems to me, that he cuts to the quick about being lowly wise and being out in the world and needing to work for change and things like that. And just his sheer commitment as a person I found overwhelming. So
I appreciate your
but the more I read it, the more of it it strikes me as extremely wise.
I think we could say that about any of the books. I mean,
sure.
Not that any of us are going to, be scholars in any one of these authors, but I think that we could all agree that if we read these books again, we'd get more out of them again and again, and give more and get more.
Yeah, absolutely true. It's the I say to my students a lot that they've read Huck Finn probably in high school, and for many of them they'll never read it again. And I strongly urge them to pick up Huck Finn again sometime in their 20s and reread it and watch how that novel changes. Whereas when you read it in your adolescent years, it's one kind of novel, and it works quite well at that level. But boy, when you come at it again as a maturing adult, it becomes a completely different novel. And I haven't read it in years, and I ought to follow my own advice now and do it again. because it will change.
And there's stories, and even in Hamlet, when he was dying, he told Horatio, "Absent thyself from felicity a while, and tell my story."
Yes.
And we want stories, and stories reflect our lives.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. That's what you were talking about earlier in the hour. I think almost everything we've read this term is almost mythic in its force. These works were not chosen by accident. You know, they really are large and dealing with large, enduring human issues. And we call it living literature. And I think it wasn't my title. It was our producer's title. And it was quite wise, actually, because that's exactly the kind of literature it is. It is quite vital, and it changes as we change, which I think is a point we really need to make. And that's been the joy of doing these works with you guys, because again, you bring a perspective to bear that I'm not used to hearing in a classroom. I was frequently surprised. I want to applaud you. I was frequently surprised at how quickly you cut right to the heart of a work as we read it. Whereas traditionally I've had to pull teeth sometimes to get a group to point B. You guys didn't even bother with point A. You just went right to point B, you know. And it was really quite remarkable the way you did that. Yeah. Yeah.
Talking about all the great selections that we've discussed this course,
Yeah.
but I have one concern.
Yeah.
There are no women authors.
Yeah, that was by design. Yeah, that was a tough issue, as you might imagine. The tendency today is to want to include multiple cultural orientations on anything you're teaching, and gender orientations and class orientations, and I applaud that. I'm in great favor of that. But when we had to do 24 one-hour programs, there was no way I was going to do justice to Eastern literature. There was no way I was going to do justice to sub-Saharan literature. You understand my trap there. All curriculum choices, your question's a good one, all curriculum choices become choices of what are you going to have to leave out. It gets really hard to do.
Did we really leave out the women? We have Eve and...
Yes, and we have Madame Bovary, and yes, that's true. But we did in terms of women authors. Yeah.
There's not
Yeah.
one woman author.
Yeah.
What would we have had? Greek would be Sappho. What else was
Well,
there?
there are plenty of choices. No, there are.
I mean, getting up to
Yeah.
those ages.
The other thing I did is I tried to think of what gap can we fill here? What is not being done? And surprisingly, this is not being done on a lot of campuses, whereas the other now is. If you look at your host, I won't by name, but look at your host institution catalog, you'll see exactly what I mean. That the old classics, and you're right, they are male, and they are Western, and they are built on a dominator culture. You know, from Genesis, which is the old story of a national epic, right on up through everything we've read here. It's dominance. You know, one definition of the hero is the hero's ability to dominate someone else. So what I was trying to recapture was that notion of the primary texts of the culture, so that one could read the multiple perspectives in other courses against that cultural background. I think we're losing that, and I'm a little worried about that, quite frankly, that we do a lot of cultural criticism without understanding the culture, without understanding where the culture comes from. I do believe in cultural criticism, but you better first know the culture before you start glibly criticizing it. I feel very strongly about that, and I had to go from my strengths. But believe me, your question is a great one, and it will be asked again and again and again of a course like this. And frankly, the other is partly what Ada was talking about in the other hour, was the desire to frankly rebel against a certain orthodoxy. You understand my point? There is a certain orthodoxy now that exists, and I wanted to rebel a little against that orthodoxy. So that's a long-winded answer to a very good question. The amazing thing in this course is that you've got a lot of those cultural feminine stereotypes to play against in your own imagination as you read through this course. I think that's real important for you to do that, and that's what you now can do. whereas before I don't think you could. Yeah, Ada?
I wondered at something that, in reading Metamorphosis,
Yeah.
that in every work from the beginning of this course, out of 23 of the 24 we've read, they all had really rather religious underpinnings, overtly, references to the church, and all of them except this last one.
Yeah. What's happening, of course, in this last one is a good point. And what's happened, of course, into the 20th century, although it is changing in the last decades of the 20th century, was a gradual, with a rise of science in the 19th century, you got a reduction in religion as a cultural force and as an intellectual force. Whereas it always was a part of the culture. And you're right in pointing it out. I mean, you go right on back to, well, how far can we go? For Christian culture, only to Dante. But in terms of a belief in beings controlling destiny, we can take it all the way back to well, of course, I skipped Genesis, didn't I? That's silly me. I was thinking of the Greeks. The mind is a terrible thing to waste here. But yeah, as you come in now to the 20th century, it becomes less a vital force, and indeed there's a rather major reaction against it settling in with in the Rosemary, don't do it. In the early in the early decades of the 20th century, where it does lose some of its force, and several things happen in the early part of the 20th century to cause people to truly be troubled by it, not the least of which was the First World War, where there was death on a rather mass scale, and it was a Wall Street war, as they say. It was hard. That had a terrible effect on people. There was gassing, there was chemical warfare. There were things that were horrifying. There's the rise of industrialization. There's the rise of capitalism. There's the alienation of the worker. I can go on and on with this. You needn't. You don't need me to do this for the 20th century. But you're right in pointing out that as we move through the 19th century, you see the church shrinking and shrinking and shrinking in its orientation. Flaubert does it very nicely, too, by making his parish priest a boob, Yeah. Yeah.
But in the face of that, it's interesting that from beginning to the end, though, the spiritual aspects of man remains predominant.
Absolutely true. I mean, absolutely true that it is one of the things that defines us. There's no doubt about it. Willard Galen talked about that. If I can take you all the way back to the beginning of the course, Willard Galen, the great bioethicist and physician and psychoanalyst who wrote Adam and Eve and Pinocchio. Do you remember him? We talked about him with Adam and Eve, and he pointed out that the gap between the amoeba and the highest primate, that gap is smaller than the leap from that highest primate to human beings. And one of the things that gives the human being that dignity from Galen's point of view was that subjunctive sense, was that sense of other, was that sense of imagination, was that, we can give it any of a number of different words. Sometimes that is spirituality, sometimes it's aesthetics. It's defined in a lot of different ways as you move through world literature, but it's clearly something other than mere physicality. There is no doubt that the human being craves much more than that.
It's not only religion, though. Religion is certainly part of it, but I was thinking about our themes, the themes that we've had through this course, and it seems like we've gone, generalizing, from large themes, moral issues and kings and grand warfare and moral laws, retribution, these big issues, to how society and background affects individuals in the literature. And it's become more introspective. And so maybe this spirit has, that you talked about is even more important in modern, because it's the individual looking at himself rather than someone like Dante telling us where he thinks we all belong, and teaching of lessons we are internalizing a little more in modern literature.
Well, it's also, too, a sense, the unsettling sense we've had since the Industrial Revolution of not being exactly sure where we are in the scheme of things. There once was a fairly secure view of where we were in the scheme of things, and that included a God, you know, up top, and I suppose Adam and Eve at the beginning. And I think I've done this metaphor with you before. Once man was or humankind was in the middle of a staircase and could look up, and the top step was bathed in light, and that was where God was, and could look to the bottom step, and there was Adam and Eve waving encouragement to you on your journey. And now we stand on a staircase and we look up, and it goes off into eternity, a concept that's very hard for us to understand. We don't know where it goes. And we look down to the bottom of the step, and it kind of goes down into some kind of primordial ooze, you know, and there's nobody up there waving us on. It's a whole different view. There's much more groping toward meaning in the 20th century than there have been in centuries before. In centuries before, there were paths laid out, and one could follow those paths with some assurance that they were going to lead to some definite end. And what happens, of course, from, you know, the Renaissance on, although it does happen earlier, but to be glib with our generalizations, what happens from the Renaissance on is we get a real questioning of those paths. Who laid them out? What was their political agenda? You know, how does it impact me? Blah, 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 blah. And so now the highways are much more difficult to find. There is some, you know, there are some who will use the old models, but there are lots who will not use the old models. And now, as even our work changes, there are a lot of people arguing, you know, Alvin Toffler and people like that arguing that we're into a third revolution. And at moments like that, people hunker down, and the questions become all the more important, because the future is, we can't even imagine. You can't even imagine what the future is going to be. And so to sketch out a roadmap for a destination that you cannot even imagine becomes an extremely difficult thing to do. And what a lot of people then want to do is to go to the old orthodoxies because they're safe. They give you answers. They give you assurance.
I like your roadway, the analogy, because I'm sure you've all had the experience of driving down an expressway with a minimum speed limit of 45, and you see the roadsides coming, and you're not familiar, and you don't know where to turn off to get where you want. You can pass your destination. Things have to happen so fast. There isn't the time for introspection because of what life has done. Yeah. Oh my word.
Are we out of time? Or? Thank you. Thank you. This is taking me quite by surprise. There, of course, is that other response to all of this, which is to let's party like it's 1999, which is, in the immortal words of Prince. Well, it's been a long journey, but boy, it sure has been fabulous. And
I'll drink to that.
yeah. 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 We'll miss this, no? Yeah. So to especially to you guys, you have been absolutely splendid. So a toast to the best class I've ever had, and I sure have enjoyed it. Yeah, yeah. I can't believe it's over. How did this happen? So keep reading, keep talking, and you've got my address.
I have
Great.
a few questions.
And a toast to our instructor.